He boarded the plane like anyone else, ticket in hand, jacket folded neatly over his arm. But in first class, not everyone believed he belonged there. Within seconds, a single remark from the man meant to fly the plane would ignite a storm that neither of them saw coming. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut deep, and millions would soon hear it. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about dignity, about presence, about who gets questioned simply for existing. And when the truth came out, one career would never recover. But to understand how it all began, you need to see who he really was. Raymond Jenkins wasn't a man who needed to prove anything. At 62, retired after decades of shaping young lives as a school principal, he carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from weathering storms most people never see. That morning, he moved through the airport with the ease of someone who knew where he was headed. Navy blazer pressed, shoes polished, a slim book of poetry tucked in his hand. For him, this trip was about peace, a small gift to himself after years of service to others. As he settled into his first-class seat, the cabin buzzed with the usual chatter and shuffling bags. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing yet. But sometimes, the calmest moments hide the sharpest edges, and one remark was about to turn this ordinary flight into a lesson the world wouldn't forget. What happened next would leave everyone on board silent, and millions online outraged. The hum of boarding chatter faded as Raymond opened his book, eyes tracing familiar lines he'd read countless times before. But the peace didn't last. A shadow passed over him, tall and self-assured, carrying the kind of arrogance that filled a room before a word was spoken. Captain Blake Renault, polished smile, mirrored sunglasses still perched on his head, the swagger of someone convinced the world bent to him. He slowed at row 2, gaze fixed on Raymond as if something didn't add up. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The words weren't shouted, but the tone cut sharp, condescending, calculated to sting. Around them, conversations paused. Raymond didn't flinch. He simply closed his book, lifted his boarding pass, and answered calmly. "That's what it says." The captain's grin widened, but it wasn't friendly. His eyes said more than his mouth ever could. Then came the quiet remark, low, dismissive, just loud enough to be heard. "Well, I suppose they're letting anyone up here now." The cabin stilled. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, while her husband instinctively raised his phone, pressing record. Something in the captain's voice didn't just sound rude. It carried a weight, an unspoken message that everyone felt, but no one wanted to name. Raymond leaned back, his expression steady. He didn't argue. He didn't meet cruelty with anger. He had spent a lifetime learning that silence at the right moment can be more powerful than any protest. Still, the damage was done. The insult hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The pilot strolled on, convinced his words would dissolve into the buzz of the safety announcements, but they didn't. They lingered. They burned. And the phone recording in row 3 captured every second. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a quiet storm began to brew. Raymond sat with his book, reading the same line over and over without truly seeing it. He wasn't shaken, not outwardly, but the tension in the cabin told another story. The strangers around him knew what they had witnessed, and one of them had already decided the world needed to see it. The clip hit the internet before the plane even left the ground. 22 seconds of arrogance, caught in perfect clarity. No captions, no commentary, just a pilot's smirk, his words, and the dignity of a man who refused to rise to the bait. Within minutes, it began to spread. By the time the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, the video was bouncing across feeds, gaining traction with every passing second. Comments poured in. Anger, shock, disbelief. The kind of reaction that only grows louder the longer it travels. And all the while, Raymond sat unaware, his eyes on poetry. While below the clouds, his story was becoming something much larger than himself. He thought the worst of the moment had passed. But what waited on the other side of the flight would shake an entire airline and end one man's career forever. At 30,000 feet, Raymond sat quietly with his book, while thousands of miles below, his face was already on millions of screens. The 22-second clip had detonated online, sparking outrage that grew louder with every refresh. Hashtags spread, petitions launched, news outlets picked it up before the plane even touched down. By the time the wheels screeched against the runway, the storm was no longer digital. It was national. As passengers filed out, Raymond walked through the terminal unaware that reporters were already waiting outside the arrival gate. But Captain Blake Renault wasn't so lucky. Mid-descent, his phone had buzzed with message after message. Screenshots, headlines, the unmistakable weight of scandal. What he thought was just another smug comment had become evidence of something far uglier. His name was trending, his reputation unraveling in real time. The airline's PR team scrambled, issuing statements that only fanned the flames. Employees whispered, passengers posted their own accounts of his arrogance, and old complaints began to resurface. What had been ignored in silence for years was now undeniable under the spotlight. For Raymond, the sting of that single remark was familiar. But seeing the world react differently this time was something new. Strangers who had never met him were defending his dignity. People who had been silent before were speaking up, furious that someone like him could still be questioned for existing in a space he had earned. By nightfall, one man's arrogance had sparked a reckoning, and the career he clung to was already slipping away. But this story wasn't just about downfall, it was about what came next, and how one man's quiet strength reminded the world of something far greater than a seat on a plane. When the flight touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Raymond Jenkins walked off quietly, just as he had boarded. Measured steps, book still tucked under his arm, and the calm composure of a man who had learned long ago that dignity was its own form of armor. What he did not know in that moment was that the entire world had already been introduced to his story. Before his feet reached the baggage claim, his name was trending, his face was circulating, and his quiet endurance had become a symbol of something far larger than himself. By that evening, news outlets were running the 22-second clip on repeat. Commentators dissected it, social media users shared it relentlessly, and people who had never met Raymond found themselves defending his right to simply exist without being questioned. For some, it was the first time they'd seen this kind of subtle racism so clearly exposed. For others, especially those who had lived it countless times, it was a painful reminder of a truth they already knew too well, that racism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and the whisper cuts just as deep. The airline scrambled into damage control. Statements were issued, apologies drafted, internal reviews announced. Within days, Captain Blake Renault found himself grounded, his once untouchable career suddenly in freefall. The arrogance he carried into the cabin that day could no longer shield him. What he thought was just another offhand remark had become undeniable evidence of a deeper prejudice, and the world was not willing to look away this time. And yet, for Raymond, the story was never about revenge or personal vindication. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded attention. He had done what he had always done, stood firmly in his own dignity, refusing to let someone else's ignorance define his worth. What struck him most in the days that followed was not the punishment of a pilot, but the awakening of thousands of strangers who suddenly cared enough to speak. His inbox filled with messages of support. Former students reached out, remembering the lessons he had given them years ago about integrity and courage. Strangers told him his silence on that plane had taught them more about strength than any speech ever could. Parents sat their children down to watch the clip, using it to explain why respect must be unconditional, why bias must be challenged, and why silence in the face of injustice cannot continue. The impact of that one flight stretched far beyond an airline scandal. It became a reminder that racism doesn't always come in the form of slurs or violence. Sometimes it shows up in a question that should never have been asked, in a smirk that tells you you're unwelcome, in the quiet suggestion that you don't belong in spaces you've earned the right to occupy. And those moments, small as they may seem, carry weight. They chip away at dignity. They tell stories of exclusion. They shape lives in ways the offender will never fully understand. But when those moments are exposed, when the world is forced to watch, they can also ignite change. Raymond's story proved that silence does not equal weakness, that composure in the face of cruelty can shine a light stronger than anger ever could, and that the world is hungry for reminders that justice begins with accountability. He never asked to be a symbol, but that day, he became one. Not because of the insult he endured, but because of the grace with which he answered it. And so, the question lingers. How many more Raymonds will it take before dignity is no longer questioned, before belonging is no longer debated, before the simplest act of sitting in a seat is free from suspicion? The story may have ended for Raymond that day, but for all of us, the lesson has only just begun, because this wasn't just his story, it's the story of millions. The real question is, what will we do with it?